2 months ago, we were in Judges probably about every other month I get up here and teach. And so when I've been teaching, we've been going through the book of Judges. So now we're picking back up in chapter 7. And if you remember, in chapter 6, we picked up with the judge Gideon. And Gideon, he was described in chapter 6 as the least of his family, as the Midianites were surrounding Israel and encroaching them and oppressing them. Gideon is this man who's kind of cowarding away and threshing wheat in the winepress so that he'd be out of view of the Midianites. And in chapter 6, we see this angel appear to him and describe him as this man of valor. And so you have this weak, cowarding man, and in chapter 6, his faith is just built up over and over, and God continues to reassure his faith because God's going to use him to lead the men of Israel into battle against this enemy that's been oppressing them. And so that's kind of where we pick up in chapter 7 here in verse 1, and we're right on right before this battle takes place. And so in verse 1 it says, "Then Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all the people who were with him rose early and encamped beside the well of Harod, so that the camp of the Midianites was on the north side of them by the hill of Moreh in the valley." And so this name Jerubbaal, what does that mean? It means Baal will contend. And if you remember back into chapter 6, Gideon went in his hometown, his father was a priest there, and they had this false idol to Baal. And Gideon goes in and he tears down the idol because the people within his village, they weren't worshiping the Lord, they were worshiping pagan gods. And so this turning back to God and having faith in God, it started with his village and his hometown. And so he tore down this idol. And in Judges chapter 6, verse 32, it says, describing this event, "Therefore on that day he called him Jerubbaal, saying, Let Baal plead against him, because he hath thrown down his altar." So what happened here was Gideon tore down the idol, and if you remember, the people in the village, they were all very angry that he took down this idol. This is what they were worshiping. And it's Gideon's father who, though he was the one that had seemingly set up this idol and was the priest in this area for this pagan worship, he makes this good point when Gideon does this and all the people are mad, and he says, if Baal is this great God and Gideon has torn down this idol of Baal, the people shouldn't need to come and defend Baal. Baal should be able to contend for himself. And so after Gideon did this, he kind of gets this title of Jerubbaal. So that's why you see that mentioned here. And so carrying on in verse 2, as we go further, it says, "And the Lord said to Gideon, The people who are with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hands, lest Israel claim glory for itself against me, saying, My own hand has saved me." All right, so Gideon, he's preparing, he's gathered up these men, and we see in the next verse here, we will know that he has 32,000 men of Israel that have come to his side who are preparing to go to battle against the Midianites. And what God is doing prior to going into this battle with all these men, God is telling Gideon, look, you've got 32,000 men, it's too many for what I want to do. If you go in with the 32,000 men, and if you remember, we'll see here actually in Judges chapter 8, verse 10, on the Midianite camp, the Midianites, the Amalekites, and the people of the east, there's 135,000 men in their camp. And so before we even get started here, and before God even sends them into battle, they're already outnumbered 4-1. You've got 32,000 men of Israel versus the 135,000 men of the enemy. And so taking that into account, them being outnumbered 4-1, God already is still telling Gideon, look, you've got too many men. If you go into battle and I deliver the victory into the hand of Israel, the men, they're going to try to lay claim to the glory. And this battle is going to be totally won on God's part and not by the strength of man. So God's telling Gideon, you have too many men, you've got to start whittling them down. And so in verse 3 it says, "Now therefore proclaim in the hearing of the people, saying, Whoever is fearful and afraid, let him turn and depart at once from Mount Gilead. And 22,000 of the people returned, and 10,000 remained." All right, so of the 32,000 men that Gideon starts with, 2/3 of them leave because they're afraid. And this isn't, this is mostly obvious, but if you think about it, in battle, if you have men that are afraid and you're going to go to battle, they're going to be a hindrance to the battle. In Deuteronomy, when Moses is giving the children of Israel instructions for how they should go to battle and all of those things, one of those instructions is to send away the people that were afraid. In Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 8, it says, "The officer shall speak further to the people and say, What what man is there who is fearful and faint-hearted? Let him go and return to his house, lest the heart of his brethren faint like his heart. So this fear, if there was men that were fearful, it was going to be contagious. It was going to infect and spread throughout the other men who maybe weren't fearful initially. And so it was important to send these men home. You didn't want them to compromise the faith and the trust that the other men had in the Lord. And so one of the things that's sad here, if you think about this, if you read from transitioning into chapter 6, verse 7, it seems apparent that the gathering of these 32,000 men with Gideon was not this military leader to the people. So the fact that he gathered these 32,000 men, it seemingly happened rather quickly. And just as quickly as these men come, and perhaps seeing the enemy and the 135,000 enemies in the camp, they say, you know what? I don't think I need to be here. I'm kind of afraid I'll just go home. You guys can take it from here. And so it's sad. Two-thirds of the people leave, and Gideon now, he's left with 10,000 men at his side. And, you know, as I read through that, and I was thinking about this and looking at, you know, what those 10,000 men probably would have been going through. They stayed and they were trusting in the Lord, even seeing these men leave. And, you know, I was thinking about, you know, just how we meet here in this school, in this gym, and we've got the, you know, the folding chairs, which are extremely comfortable. We've got the AC, which seems like it's always on full blast, even if it's plenty cold in here. And despite all those things, right, anyone could just say, you know what, you know, I'll go somewhere with nice cushion chairs, or I'll go somewhere where they've got an actual building and all of that stuff. But, you know, us and all, you know, we come here because we're trusting in God and because we want to hear the word taught, and the word is taught here. Not to say if you go to another church that's a bad thing, but the people who do stick around here and do come, you're coming for a reason. And one of the things that's kind of a blessing of the school is that we know that people aren't coming here just because we've got real nice chairs or real nice lights and everything like that. You're coming here because you want to be fed by the word, you want to be taught. And I think like these 10,000 men that remain, you know, they stayed because they were trusting in the Lord. They didn't leave when things got hard or inconvenient where they were scared. You know, these men stuck around. And so as we go on, we find that this 10,000, it still is going to be too many, though, for the Lord to deliver the Midianites into Gideon's hands, into Israel's hands. So in verse 4 it says, but the Lord said to, or actually, and just to line us up, so before when they started it was 4-1, now they're outnumbered 14-1. And in verse 4, we see it says, but the Lord said to Gideon, the people are still too many. Bring them down to the water, and I will test them for you there. Then it will be that of whom I say to you, this one shall go with you, the same shall go with you. And of whomever I say to you, this one shall not go with you, the same shall not go. All right, and so as if 14-1, being outnumbered 14-1 wasn't insurmountable enough, God tells Gideon, look, I've got to whittle you down even more. You know, there's still too many men. And God knows, you know, there's still some men in that remaining 10,000, there's still some of them that still would try to claim the glory when the victory was won. And you think it's 14-1 odds. How could any man think of, you know, claiming victory for themselves if they did win the battle with the 10,000? And, you know, I don't know. My dad would tell me stories like, oh, you know, I played football. If it was just me versus the other team, you know, I would still win and all stuff. It's like, that's how men are. You know, men will take credit. Even with crazy odds, it's like, there's no way. 14-1, you're out of your mind. But God knows, you know, there were men that still would try to claim that. And so he tells Gideon, I've got to whittle down the men even more so that there's no way that these men can tell a story and try to claim the glory. And so that's what he does in verse 5. It says, so he brought the people down to the water, and the Lord said to Gideon, everyone who laps from the water with his tongue as a dog laps, you shall set apart by himself. Likewise, everyone who gets down on his knees to drink. And the number of those who lapped, putting their hand to their mouth, was 300 men. But all the rest of the people got down on their knees to drink water. All right, so seemingly an odd test of how to discern which people to keep and which people to send home. You've got on one side you've got the men who get down on their knees and basically put their face into the water and drink directly from it. And then on the other end you've got the men who seemingly scoop up the water into their hand and then lap it like a dog. And it kind of makes you wonder, it's like, okay, well, you know, why is that the test? And, you know, maybe one of the reasons is that the men who are getting down on their knees and putting their face in the water, they're dropping their alertness and awareness for even just a moment to get some water, while the men who scoop it up to their hand and are lapping it like a dog, they're still looking around. They can see if there's the enemy coming for an attack. And so perhaps it's because these men that were being vigilant, these are the ones that the Lord wanted Gideon to keep. And so it reminds me of back in high school during wrestling practices, we'd have several breaks during practice, and you would, everyone who didn't bring a water jug would go run to the water fountain. And if you've wrestled, if you're cutting weight for wrestling, once you get to like the day before the tournament, the way you lose most of the weight is through water weight and through sweat. And so when everyone runs to the water fountain, and you got the guys, it would always be like the freshmen or the sophomores, and they would go to the fountain, they're cutting weight, they're really close, and they get to the drinking fountain, they're so thirsty, and they just drink and drink and drink and drink the water. And it's like, what are you doing? Like, that water, you can't lose that water that you just drink, because it's going to take too long to get through your system for you to sweat it out. They had no control. They dropped their alertness for a split second just because they were exhausted. Whereas the more experienced people would say, okay, you get just enough to quench your thirst, and then you're good, you stop. And so I kind of think, that's kind of what's going on with these men here. They dropped their alertness even for a split second, while these other men, they were staying vigilant the whole time. And so we go here now from 10,000 men to 300 who passed this test. And it says, then the Lord, in verse 7, it says, then the Lord said to Gideon, by the 300 men who lapped, I will save you, and deliver the Midianites into your hand. Let all the other people go, every man to his place. All right, so we've got 300 men remaining now. We started with 32,000. And God, he reaffirms Gideon that these are the men he's going to use for the battle. These are the men that he's going to deliver the victory into their hands against the Midianites. And so we started with 32,000. We're down to 300, and it's just 1% of what Gideon started with. And now they're outnumbered 450 to 1. And so where there might have been a guy that wanted to try to make a crazy claim that they defeated the Midianites by their own might at 14 to 1, now no one would believe them. Being outnumbered 450 to 1, there's no way that they would win the battle on their own strength other than it being God who intervened for them. And so this is what God tells Gideon, these are the men I'm going to use for when I deliver the Midianites into your hand. And if we go back to Deuteronomy chapter 20, that same chapter we referenced earlier, in Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 3 and 4, Moses, as he's given these instructions to Israel, he tells them, in Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 3 and 4, and he shall say to them, hear, O Israel, today you are on the verge of battle with your enemies. Do not let your heart faint, do not be afraid, and do not tremble or be terrified because of them. For the Lord your God is he who goes with you, to fight for you against your enemies, to save you. And so if you remember here, at the time, the period of the judges in Israel, one of the things that they needed to learn during this period was to trust in the Lord. They went off into pagan practice. They were not following the Lord. They didn't have faith, and they weren't trusting in the Lord. They had forgotten him. And if you go back even further in Judges to chapter 3, verse 1, it says, now these are the nations which the Lord left, that he might test Israel by them, that is, all who had not known any of the wars in Canaan. And so these generations that lived during the period of the Judges, they had forgotten, they weren't around when Israel went to war and God was fighting the battles for them and delivering the victories. They weren't around for that. And so God left these enemies in the land that they would learn how to fight. But the thing is, God wasn't trying to teach them how to fight on their own strength or by their own might. God was leaving these enemies in these battles in front of them so that they would learn how to fight, trusting in him and trusting in God to deliver the victory for them. And so that's what these men were going to learn. These 300 men that remained with Gideon, they were going to learn how to go into battle and trust in the Lord and not in their own might to win. And so as we continue on into verse 8, it says, so the people took provisions and their trumpets in their hands, and he sent away all the rest of Israel, every man to his tent, and retained those 300 men. Now the camp of Midian was below him in the valley. And so what we see here, obviously they have a strategic advantage where they can see the camp of Midian in the valley. The men that didn't pass the test, they have left, and it seems like they've left some provisions. Obviously, what we'll see ahead is obviously they left some of the trumpets or ram horns behind for the remaining 300 men. And we keep going in verse 9. It says, it happened on the same night that the Lord said to Gideon, Arise, go down against the camp, for I have delivered it into your hand. But if you are afraid to go down to the camp with Purah, your servant. And you shall hear what they say, and afterward your hand shall be strengthened to go down against the camp. And then he went down with Purah, his servant, to the outpost of the armed men who were in the camp. All right, so what do we see here in verse 9? In verse 9, God tells Gideon, look, you got the 300 men, that's all I need. You're ready now, you can go into the battle. But he tells Gideon, he offers Gideon another chance for reassurance just in case Gideon wasn't ready, because he says, but if you are afraid, he tells Gideon, go down to the camp with Purah, your servant, and then when he returns, what he'll hear there, his hands will be strengthened. So Gideon obviously had some doubt or fear because he decides, I'm going to go down to the camp and get some more reassurance, which if it was me and there's 300 men against 135,000, even if I thought I was reassured, I probably would still go to the camp and hear what the Lord was going to do, because the Lord said, your hands will be strengthened. It's like, okay, I want that. So what happens here? Gideon goes down to the camp in verse 12 and says, now the Midianites and Amalekites, all the people of the east, were lying in the valley as numerous as locusts, and their camels were without numbers, as the sand by the seashore in multitude. And when Gideon had come, there was a man telling a dream to his companion. He said, I have had a dream. To my surprise, a loaf of barley bread tumbled into the camp of Midian, came to a tent and struck it so that it fell and overturned, and the tent collapsed. Then his companion answered and said, this is nothing else but the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. And to his hand God has delivered Midian and the whole camp. All right, so of all of the men, the 135,000 men of the enemy, Gideon happens to come to this outpost, over here just these two men in the enemy camp, and where one of them just happens to have had a dream and just happens to be telling it to the other man, and the other man just happens to have an interpretation for the dream. And this man's interpretation of the other Midianite's dream is that this wild image of the small loaf of barley tumbling into the camp and striking a tent, he interprets that as God, or the sword of Gideon, coming against the camp, and that God, the God of Israel, has delivered the Midianites already into the hands of Israel. And so if you're Gideon, and you've heard the Lord say, go down to the camp and hear what they say, and this is what you hear, there's no doubt for Gideon. Like, there's no coincidence that this was not of the Lord. And so Gideon does. He returns to the camp, and now his hands have been strengthened to hear this. He's totally reassured. In verse 15, it tells us that, and it says, and so it was, when Gideon heard the telling of the dream and its interpretation, that he worshipped. He returned to the camp of Israel and said, arise, for the Lord has delivered the camp of Midian into your hand. And so Gideon goes back, hearing this good news and this reassurance from the Lord. He returns to the camp, and he's probably immensely joyous and excited about what he's just heard, and about the fact that God is with them, and they're about to defeat the Midianites who have been oppressing Israel for several years now. And so his hands were strengthened. God reassured him. And just like God can reassure us, if we're seeking God out in prayer, God will reassure us, and He will strengthen our hands when we're looking for Him and He answers. And verse 16 says, then he divided the 300 men into 3 companies, and he put a trumpet into every man's hand with empty pitchers and torches inside the pitchers. All right, so Gideon's returned from the Midianite camp after going out to hear what they had to say and after being reassured. And so now he's preparing the men for battle. Gideon's ready to take the men and be faithful and trust in the Lord and go into battle. And so he's kind of laying out the battle plan for what the men are supposed to do. And so he splits the 300 men into groups of 100, 3 groups of 100. And he tells them in the left hand they're going to hold clay pitchers with torches inside it. And in their right hands they're going to hold trumpets or ram horns. And if you just look here, what hand are they supposed to be holding their sword? None. Nowhere here does Gideon tell them, in your left hand or right hand, or I want half the men to hold the sword. All of the men are told, left hand I want you to hold the clay pitchers with the torches, and your right hand I want you to hold the trumpets. None of them are commanded to have the sword ready in their hands. That's important because this was going to be a battle won by the Lord and not by the sword of man. And so in verse 17 it goes on and says, and he said to them, look at me and do likewise. Watch. And when I come to the edge of the camp, you shall do as I do. When I blow the trumpet, I and all who are with me Then you also blow the trumpets on every side of the whole camp and say, 'The sword of the Lord and of Gideon.' So Gideon and the 100 men who were with him came to the outpost of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, just as they had posted the watch. And they blew trumpets and broke the pitchers that were in their hands. Then the 3 companies blew the trumpets and broke the pitchers. They held the torches in their left hands and the trumpets in their right hands for blowing. And they cried, 'The sword of the Lord and of Gideon.'" All right, and so they're coming and they're surrounding the camp, and they're doing this at night. And it's really quite a brilliant plan that Gideon has put together, because they're attacking at night, and they've got these clay pitchers with the torches inside, and that was to conceal the light, to not give it away that they were coming. And what would happen is when they break these clay pitchers, that oxygen would rush in and it would reignite the torch, and that light would appear from the torch. And back in that day, it would be typical to have 1 torch per every 1,000 men. And so there's kind of some deception going on here with how many men there's going to be coming, because the Midianites are going to be woken up in the middle of the night and they're going to see all of these torches. On top of that, you've got all 300 men blowing these trumpets, and you have all of this noise. And so they're these men who, on Gideon's side, who were now outnumbered 450 to 1, from the Midian perspective, the Midianites, as they're waking up, they're seeing all of these torches and assuming that there's thousands of men behind all of these torches. They're waking up and they're the ones thinking that they're outnumbered. And there's panic that sets in and confusion, because there's got all these trumpet blasts and all these torches. And, Friday, 2 weeks ago, it was actually, for once, we had really nice weather. It was sunny out, it was warmer. We went for a walk, Mallory and I and Riley. And it was really nice outside. And I was exhausted from the work week. And I remember we were laying in bed, and Mallory was watching one of the many cooking competition shows that she normally watches. And I fell asleep, because I always fall asleep. And it was midnight, and I remember waking up at midnight, and you kind of open your eyes, and everything's black, the TV's off, and I'm trying to orient myself. And I just hear, boom after boom from the thunder. And in the shades, I can see just flash of the lightning peeking through. And I'm like, okay, it's storming. It's weird. It wasn't storming. It wasn't, didn't even look like it was going to storm when I went to bed. And so I'm continuing to orient myself, and then I kind of hear this faint tornado siren going off, and I'm like, what is going on? Is there a tornado? Am I dreaming? And so I'm like frantically kind of scattering. I'm waking up Mallory and saying, should we go downstairs? What's going on? I'm trying to pull up the radar and all this stuff. And there's just this confusion and panic set in. And when I was younger, I probably would have, a lot of things change when you get a wife and you have a child. Like when I was younger, I probably would have woke up like, oh, okay, I'm going back to bed. And for whatever reason, now you've got a family you're trying to protect, and when you wake up and you're just abruptly woken up in this confusion, you start panicking. Now, once we got downstairs, we figured out what was going on, and everything was fine. And I remember Mallory was like, oh yeah, my dad said he needs to go out and cover up the shingles that are outside. I'm like, yeah, he must be, he's a real man, because he's like, they were getting the roof put on the next day. And I'm like, aren't the shingles, they're supposed to get wet? I was like, why didn't you go cover them? It's like, but that's something a man would do. Like, oh, it's storming, I'm gonna go outside, gotta, get these things taken care of in the middle of this tornado that might be coming. But so you return to, this passage. You had these Midianites. They were abruptly woken up. There's confusion. There's chaos. They see all these torches. They're the ones who think they're outnumbered now. And what happens is these men, they shout, "The sword of the Lord and of Gideon." And one of the things that's kind of interesting here is, if you remember from the interpretation of the dream that the Midianite had, he says that this is nothing else but the sword of Gideon. And I think it's kind of interesting that Gideon, though, he tells his men not to chant, the sword of Gideon against them. He says, we want to shout the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. So Gideon's remembering, this is not them. This is the sword of the Lord coming against them. And he wanted the Midianites to know that this was God of Israel coming and fighting on their behalf. All right, and so you can pull back up that map of the battle. And so you'll see here, let's see if I can get this to work. There we go. All right. Ooh. All right. So, I'll zoom out a little bit. That red circle there, that is basically where they were encamped. This is where the battle would have taken place. And that black line, as you can see, as the men flee, because what will happen is they get confused and the battle begins. What we'll read in the next couple of verses, that the Midianites and all the enemy camp, they start fleeing and running away. So that's kind of like the trajectory of where things are going to take place over the rest of chapter 7 and chapter 8. And so in verse 21 it says, "And every man stood in his place all around the camp, and the whole army ran and cried out and fled. When the 300 blew the trumpets, the Lord set every man's sword against his companion throughout the whole camp. And the army fled to Beth Acacia toward Zerah, as far as the border of Abel Meholah by Tabbath." All right, so as we talked about, the confusion had set in with the enemy. And actually, one of the things to remember, which I didn't mention earlier, and I forgot, but I think it was important. When Gideon went down to the camp and overheard the Midianite man talking about the dream, God was already at work setting fear into the enemy, right? The men at that point, even before the battle had begun, already were fearful and knew that God was going to deliver them into the hands of Israel. And so we're seeing that play out here. The men are confused here, and now what it describes is that as the men were abruptly broken up, it says that every man's sword was set against his companion. So it's not the Israelites who are drawing their swords and attacking the men. It's the enemies within the camp who are attacking each other because they're so confused. And perhaps one of the other things that played into this is that this enemy alliance that was against Israel probably wasn't the strongest alliance. You had the Midianites, the Amalekites, and the people of the east. They were probably joined together in the fact that they hated Israel and wanted to get rid of Israel. But them together probably wasn't the strongest alliance. And so as all this confusion set in and these men are running, it's nighttime, you can't see, they're drawing their swords against each other and slaying one another and fleeing at the same time. And in verse 23 it says, "And the men of Israel gathered together from Naphtali, Asher, and all Manasseh, and pursued the Midianites. Then Gideon sent messengers throughout all the mountains of Ephraim, saying, 'Come down against the Midianites, and seize from them the watering places as far as Beth-barah and the Jordan.' Then all the men of Ephraim gathered together and seized watering places as far as Beth-barah and the Jordan." All right, so Gideon's 300 men, they're pursuing after the Midianites. And the men of Ephraim, they respond in agreement that they respond to these messengers that Gideon sent, and they agree to pursue the Midianites as well and come alongside and help. And verse 25 it says, "And they captured 2 princes of the Midianites," and this is talking about the Ephraimites, "and they captured 2 princes of the Midianites, Oreb and Zeb. They killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb, and Zeb they killed at the winepress of Zeb." Seemingly these places were not named this beforehand, but were named this after these men were killed there, these princes of Midian. And it says, "They pursued Midian and brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon on the other side of the Jordan." And in chapter 8, verse 1, it goes on and says, "Now the men of Ephraim said to him, 'Why have you done this to us by not calling us when you went to fight with the Midianites?' And they reprimanded him sharply. So he said to them, 'What have I done now in comparison with you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the vintage of Abiezer?'" And Abiezer is the village where Gideon was from. Verse 3, "God has delivered into your hands the princes of Midian, Oreb and Zeb. And what was I able to do in comparison with you?" Then their anger toward him subsided when he said that. When Gideon came to the Jordan, he and the 300 men who were with him crossed over, exhausted, but still in pursuit. All right, so observe here now, what has taken place. Gideon and his men, they've overcome the Midianites, even though they were outnumbered 450 to 1, and they're still in pursuit of the remaining Midianites who are fleeing. And in Judges chapter 8, verse 10, and we'll get there, but we see it says there that 120,000 of the Midianite men had fallen so far. And what happens here in these verses is that the men of Ephraim, they're angry. They wanted to partake in this glorious victory that God was delivering for Israel. And the question is, where were these men? One of the questions is, where were these men before the battle began? Why weren't they there when the odds were so insurmountable? But now they're angry that Gideon didn't include them in this battle. And one of the things that's happening here is that these men, they're envious of what has just taken place. They want to lay claim to the glory of this great defeat that Gideon had been led by. And if you recall earlier in the chapter, the whole reason God was dwindling down Gideon's army was because he didn't want any man to try to lay claim to the glory. So you have these men who are saying, "Hey, you left us out. We wanted to be a part of this. We wanted to get the credit for this battle and be a part of it." They probably also were envious of the spoils and the plunder that the men probably would have gathered from the Midianite men who had fallen during this battle. And so if you look at, this happens in ministry all the time. You have people who come in, they see something God is working, they want to take credit for themselves. They want to get involved because rather than wanting to get involved and be serious about the ministry and wanting to contribute and do what the Lord is doing, they want to get involved because it's their own pride that gets in the way. And if you look at Isaiah chapter 14, verse 12 through 15, it kind of touches on this pride. It says, "How you are fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning, how you are cut down to the ground, you who weaken the nations. For you have said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will also sit on the mount of the congregation on the farthest sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. Yet you shall be brought down to Sheol, to the lowest depths of the pit." And so this is pride. Pride we see here described of Satan. Pride in man, this fleshly desire to exalt ourselves up to God's level, right? These men of Ephraim, they wanted to be, they're mad because they weren't included in the battle because they wanted to take credit for themselves. And we know there was no credit for them to even take, even if they were there. The credit was all to God. The men of Gideon didn't do anything other than be faithful and follow what God was telling them to do. And so, again, as I think about our church, we typically, 30 to 40 people here on a Sunday. And, we're small here, but God is mighty and God can do a great work even with this church, no matter how small we are. We don't have all the resources, but we can pray. We have the Word of God. We can follow His commands. That's all that God needs. God didn't need the 32,000 men for Gideon. All He needed was 300 to be faithful and listen to Him for Him to do this great work. And so the reason I bring that up, though, is because there might be something that's great and miraculous that God does with this church. And when that happens, there may be people that suddenly appear who want to get involved and say, I want to be a part of this, and they might have bad motives and say, they really want to get involved because they want to take credit for what's going on. And so we need to be watchful of that, and we also need to be watchful of it for ourselves, because if something like that happens here, we'll be tempted to say, look at what we did, right? There's a lot of things that go into setting up on a Sunday here and making it to where things work. They're really not necessary to make things work, because we could get up here and Tom or I can teach just by having the Bible, no speakers, no lights. We don't need any of that. But if things start to grow, it's very easy for us to look at the things that we're doing and say, look what I did, and this is why things are going well. And we want to be careful for that not to happen, right? We want to have no distractions, but we want to be focused on what is God doing, or we be faithful to God's word and what He's commanding us to do. And so Gideon here, we go back to the text, he's diffusing the situation with these men of Ephraim, and he points out, look, we were part of the initial battle, but look what you guys have done. The men of Ephraim, you guys have captured the princes and killed them, Oreb and Zeb. And so Gideon's telling them, look, we chased these men down, but you guys killed the princes. So it's why are you guys all upset, making a fuss about this? And in verse 4, as it goes on and tells us about Gideon continuing to pursue, one thing I want to note there is it says that Gideon and his men, it says they were exhausted, but they were still in pursuit. And I was listening to Joe Foch was giving a sermon on this. It was an old sermon, but I was listening to it, and he made a distinction there. He said it says they were exhausted. They were exhausted in the battle, is how he put it, but they weren't exhausted of the battle. Right? When you follow the Lord and you're being faithful, and these men, they were tired. This was a hard battle, and they had been going for several hours now chasing these men. But they were still faithful, and they were following through with what God was telling them. They weren't tired of the battle, but they were tired in the battle. But they were still trusting God to carry them through. And I think that's important for us to remember. I'm going to bring up a couple of verses for us to reference first here before I make my point. But in Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 through 30, it says, "Come to me," this is Jesus speaking, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." And then in 1 John chapter 5, verse 3, it says, "For this is the love of God, that we keep His commandments, and His commandments are not burdensome." And then lastly, in Psalm 55, verse 22, it says, "Cast your burden on the Lord, and He shall sustain you. He shall never permit the righteous to be moved." And so if you think about these men of Gideon and apply it to your own life and your ministry and how you're following God, it's easy to get tired and feel like, I'm doing this week after week. I don't think I can keep doing it. I can't keep up. And if you get the feeling like that, probably the problem is not that God has put too much on your plate. It isn't the problem that God's put too much plate. The problem is that you are the one trying to do all these things, right? If God's telling you to do something, his burden is light. He will carry you through it. He will enable you to do it. Now, if you overload your schedule, and this could happen too, you might be doing things that maybe God isn't calling you to do, but you're trying to overextend yourself and say, oh, I got to do this, I got to do this. There's not enough, people reading reach here. Like maybe you're trying to push yourself into ministries that God isn't calling you to because He has other people for those ministries. So it's important for us to reflect and realize if we're feeling tired, we need to understand that, we're probably trying to do things on our own might rather than relying on God. And that's the whole, one of the main points of this chapter is that these 300 men, they weren't going after the Midianites under their own might. They were going underneath God's might. God was going to deliver the victory for them. And so in chapter 8, verse 5, it says, Then he said to the men of Succoth, Please give loaves of bread to the people who follow me, for they are exhausted, and I am pursuing Zebah and Zalmunna, kings of Midian. And the leaders of Succoth said, Are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna now in your hand, that we should give bread to your army? And so what are these men of Succoth saying? These are fellow Israelites. Why aren't they happy to help the men of Gideon and give them food and help replenish them as they're pursuing the enemy? And it seems here that essentially they'd rather shelter the enemy because living on the other side of the Jordan, they were close to the Midianite camp where they would come in and ravage the land during the harvest. And so these men are thinking, we don't really want to be seen helping you in case this battle doesn't go how you think it's going to go. Right? They're basically saying, we don't really trust that the Lord is necessarily going to deliver the Midianites into your hands. So we'll keep our bread, and when you've killed the kings of Midianites and you've defeated them, then come back and we'll give you bread then. And they're kind of mocking them because they don't really believe that they're going to win this battle. They're seeing the 300 men. They're looking at it from the human perspective. They see Gideon's 300 men. There's still 15,000 Midianites to slay. They're just like, these numbers don't add up. You guys are kind of out of your minds. And if we are seen helping you, it's just going to be bad for us. And in verse 7, this continues on. Gideon says, So Gideon said, For this cause, when the Lord has delivered Zebah and Zalmunna into my hand, then I will tear your flesh with the thorns of the wilderness and with briars. Then he went up from there to Penuel and spoke to them in the same way. And the men of Penuel answered him as the men of Succoth had answered. So he also spoke to the men of Penuel, saying, When I come back in peace, I will tear down this tower. So he's referring to this tower that would have been in Penuel, and likely it was a watchtower for their defenses. It would have been a high point for them to see if the enemy was coming and stuff like that. So Gideon's saying, when I come back, I'm going to tear down this tower. And it's sad, but it's this refusal of the Israelites to all come collectively together and work together to defeat the enemy and trust in the Lord. But that's the pattern that we see in Judges, is this refusal for the Israelites to turn to the Lord. And so in verse 10, it says, Now Zebah and Zalmunna were at Karkor, and their enemies with them, about 15,000. All who were left of all the army of the people of the east, for 120,000 men who drew the sword, had fallen. Then Gideon went up by the road of those who dwell in tents on the east of Nobah and Jogabah, and he attacked the army while the camp felt secure. And when Zebah and Zalmunna fled, he pursued them. And he took the 2 kings of Midian, Zebah and Zalmunna, and routed the whole army. All right, so again, even with the 300 men and the 15,000 remaining Midianites, Gideon, by the help of the Lord, overcomes these odds, and he captures the 2 kings of the Midianites. And in verses 13 and 14 it says, Then Gideon, the son of Joash, returned from battle from the ascent of Heres, and he caught a young man of the men of Succoth and interrogated him. And he wrote down for him the leaders of Succoth and its elders, 77 men. All right, so at this point, Gideon, the Lord has delivered the battle into Gideon's hand. He's won. He's captured these 2 kings. Now he's returning back to these 2 cities, villages, where they refused to help the men as they were in pursuit and needed to be replenished. And so he's returning to these places, and one of the things he does is he captures or finds this young man from Succoth, and he starts to interrogate him. And Gideon basically is looking to find out, who are the leaders and elders of Succoth, because he's going to go back, and these are the men that, as we find, he's going to, teach them. And so he tracks down this man, and you got to imagine, at this time, it's like, I don't know what, it says that the young man wrote down for him who the leaders were, and I don't know what you would write down at that time, because if you wrote down names, it's like, okay, that's a name. It's like we don't have, Google or something or LinkedIn for me to go look up what these guys look like. So he gave them a pretty good description. I'm sure this guy, this young man Sukkoth, he probably would have been, happy if he lived in our time. He could probably just be like, hand him like a team football photo and say, here's the elders of Sukkoth, year 1184 BC. These are guys you're looking for. But he can't do that in his time. So somehow he writes down descriptions of how Gideon can find out who these elders are. And in verse 15 it says, "Then he came to the men of Sukkoth and said, Here are Zebah and Zalmunna, about whom you ridiculed me, saying, Are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna now in your hand, that we should give bread to your weary men? And he took the elders of the city and the thorns of the wilderness and briars, and with them he taught the men of Sukkoth." So, I think it's pretty apparent to understand what he was teaching them about with the thorns and the wilderness and the briars. So clearly he taught them a lesson. And in verse 17 it says, "Then he tore down the tower of Penuel and killed the men of the city." And so again, we talked about this tower in Penuel as this watchtower. And so it seems to me that the reason he tears down this tower is because these men of Penuel didn't want to be seen as helping Gideon's men in case they failed. They were fearful if Gideon's men failed, the enemy will come against us. Well, Gideon returns and tears down their tower, which would have been one of their strong defense points to prevent attacks from the enemy. So now Gideon takes down that tower. And so it's kind of like, well, you weren't going to help us because you were afraid of the enemy. Well, now you have a reason to be afraid of the enemy because this tower has been torn down. In verse 18, as we go on, it says, "And he said to Zebah and Zalmunna, What kind of men were they whom you killed at Tabor? So they answered, As you are, so were they. Each one resembled the son of a king. Then he said, They were my brothers, the sons of my mother. As the Lord lives, if you had let them live, I would not kill you. And Gideon said to Jether his firstborn, Rise, kill them. But the youth would not draw his sword, for he was afraid, because he was still a youth." All right, so Gideon, he's got these two kings, and he's about to kill them and bring justice for his brothers who had been killed in the battle by the Midianites. And one of the things that Gideon does here is he first instructs his son to be the one to kill these Midianite kings. He asks, why would he do this? His son was young, as we see from the text. And one reason is probably because if his son kills these Midianite kings, his son will kind of get this badge of honor for being the one that slayed the kings. And so he would be remembered for that. And so that would always be to his credit, even though the credit was all God's anyways. But the other reason, and this might be more so, the reason Gideon might be having his son do it was to humiliate these kings. It wasn't going to be Gideon who led these men in this tremendous battle where they were overcome. It wasn't Gideon who was going to kill these men. It was going to be his son, this young kid. And so these kings were going to die at the hands of a young kid, and would be a much less honorable death. It would be a humiliating death to die to this young man. And so what we see here, though, is that Gideon's son, he's too afraid to do it. He's still too young. Like he just doesn't. He doesn't have the courage. He doesn't have the bravery. He's a kid. He's like, Dad, I'm not going to kill these men. Like, you do it. So verse 21 it says, "So Zebah and Zalmunna said, Rise yourself and kill us. For as a man is, so is his strength. So Gideon arose and killed Zebah and Zalmunna, and he took the crescent ornaments that were on their camels' necks." All right, so Zebah and Zalmunna in this situation, being about to get killed, they're probably trying to entice Gideon, like, you kill us. We want you to kill us. Probably saying some things to kind of stir up Gideon. His son won't draw the sword, and so they want Gideon to do it. One, because, like we said, it'd be much more honorable for them to die at the hands of Gideon than Gideon's son. But also probably because, as we can see, Gideon's son was afraid. These men are probably like, if Gideon kills us, it's probably going to be a much quicker, and although it'd be painful, it'd be much quicker and end with pretty fast. Whereas if his son does it, who knows? He might do some kind of hack job and not do it right. It's like, they probably didn't want to go through that. So they're probably very eagerly enticing Gideon, like, you're the one who won this battle. You're the one that we want to kill us. And so that's what happened. Gideon kills these two kings. And in verse 22, it goes on, it says, "The men of Israel said to Gideon, Rule over us, both you and your son, and your grandson also, for you have delivered us from the hand of Midian. But Gideon said to them, I will not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you." You see, the men of Israel, they're so quickly to kind of turn, they've been delivered in this battle by God, and so quickly turn back to trying to be like these pagan cultures that had their own king, and they're saying, oh, Gideon was the one who led this battle. Let's make Gideon our king. He can rule over us. And Gideon's telling them, like, look, you know, none of this credit is for myself. It's all for God. You know, God should be the one ruling over you. That's the whole reason they got into this mess, is because they weren't having God rule over them. And by making Gideon their king, they would go right back into the same problem if they were to do that. So Gideon refuses. And, you know, we see this a lot, you know, where, you know, people see someone doing good work and they want to try to elevate them, you know, and say, oh, look at this great work you're doing such a great thing. And you know, they forget that, you know, God's just using, that person's just a vessel. God's just using them. In Acts chapter 3, verses 11 and 12, when they healed the lame man, when Peter does, it says, now as the lame man who was healed held on to Peter and John, all the people ran together to them in the porch, which is called Solomon's, greatly amazed. So when Peter saw it, he responded to the people, men of Israel, why do you marvel at this? Or why look so intently at us, as though by our own power or godliness we had made this man walk? Right? Gideon here, he does the right thing. He says, I don't want the credit for this battle. It's not my credit to even claim. It was all the Lord's. Give credit to the Lord. It was God's power that delivered the Midianites into our hands. It had nothing to do with me. Look to the Lord. And it's important that as in ministry, if people start looking at you, always point them to the Lord. Never point them to yourself, because it's not anything that you've done by your own works. It's all the Lord. In verse 26, it says, now the weight of the gold earrings that Gideon, requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, besides the crescent ornaments, pendants, and purple robes which were on the kings of Midian, and besides the chains that were around their camels' necks. Then Gideon made it into an ephod and set it up in his city, Ophrah, and all Israel played the harlot with it there. It became a snare to Gideon and to his house. All right, so what happens? After we see Gideon, he rejected the credit, he gave it to the Lord, and we start to see this mistake that Gideon makes. As for the gold that Gideon requested, it looks like the 1,700 shekels, it probably would be around 50 pounds of gold, which would be a very sizable fortune. And it tells us that Gideon makes this into an ephod, which was a shirt-like garment that would have been worn by the priest of Israel. And if you remember the context of the book of Judges, one of the things that you see that's pretty much absent from the whole book is the lack of the priesthood and leading the people spiritually back to God. The priesthood really is not mentioned at all. When there's trouble in the land, God raises up not a priest to guide the people back, but he raises up these judges to deliver the enemy into the hands of Israel. And so perhaps Gideon, by creating this golden ephod, it says he sets it up in Ophrah. It may be that he's trying to create this kind of rival place of worship compared to the tabernacle, which would have been at Shiloh, which was in the territory of Ephraim. If you remember back a couple of verses, the men of Ephraim were angry at Gideon that they weren't included in the initial battle. And so maybe that's one aspect of why Gideon is kind of setting up this symbol of the priest in his home area of Ophrah. But another thing, and this is what Spurgeon said regarding this. Spurgeon says, he did not set up an idol, but he made an ephod, an imitation of that wonderful vestment worn by the high priest. Perhaps he made it of solid gold, not to be worn, but to be looked at, simply to remind the people of the worship of God, and not to be itself worshipped. But dear friends, you see here that if we go half an inch beyond what God's word warrants, we always get into mischief. And that's pretty much what we see happening. This golden ephod, which maybe Gideon intended it for good, it became a snare to Gideon and his family and to people. They began to worship it. It became an idol to them. And it's kind of funny because if you remember Gideon chapter 6, he tore down the idol to Baal in his home village. And so he sets this up, and you give people something to look at, they'll start worshiping it. It seems like that's how we are. Like we don't physically see God, we don't always physically hear God, and so we look for physical things to worship and draw our attention to instead of the Lord. And so in verse 28, as we keep going here and we start to wrap up, it says, thus Midian was subdued before the children of Israel, so that they lifted their heads no more, And the country was quiet for 40 years in the days of Gideon. Then Jerubbaal, the son of Joash, went and dwelt in his own house. Gideon had 70 sons who were his own offspring, for he had many wives. All right, so a couple of things here. We see that after this battle, after God delivered this battle and victory over the Midianites, it says that the land had peace for 40 years. And unfortunately, what we start to see with Gideon is he doesn't quite finish that strongly. Though he rejected the glory of the victory and refused to rule over the people, what we find here is that it says in these verses that he had 70 sons. And while we're probably thankful that all 70 sons were not from the same wife, it's also unfortunate that he took many wives for himself. And, it's 70 sons, and you think, 70 kids, which is still like a crazy amount, but it's like that's just the number of the sons. We don't know how many daughters he had also. And in verse 31 it says, "And his concubine, who was in Shechem, also bore him a son, whose name he called Abimelech." And so you stop here and you say, okay, if you're just quickly reading over this, it's like, okay, he had another son, kind of what's the big deal here? But if you look at this name, Abimelech, remember Gideon, he refused to rule over the people and be king. If you break down this name, Abimelech, you have Ab, which means father, and Melech, which means king. And the name together, the name means my father is king. And so it's just this unfortunate thing and this decline that happens in Israel with his son. Like his Gideon refused to be king, but his son gets this name, my father is king. And so it's just unfortunate because Gideon was a king. Gideon wasn't to be looked at like a king. It was God who should have gotten all the credit. And in verse 32, we go on and it says, "Now Gideon the son of Joash died at a good old age and was buried in the tomb of Joash his father in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. So it was, as soon as Gideon was dead, that the children of Israel again played the harlot with the Baals and made Baal-berith their god. Thus the children of Israel did not remember the Lord their God, who had delivered them from the hands of all their enemies on every side. Nor did they show kindness to the house of Jerubbaal, Gideon, in accordance with the good he had done for Israel." And so that will kind of tie in, it'll segue into chapter 9, which we're not going to do today, but we'll pick up again at some point in the future. But it's easy to look at this, and it's easy to look at this with most of the cases of the judges that rise up, and it always ends, there's peace, and then you kind of get segued into the next judge. It's like, Israel returned to worshiping pagan gods and rejecting God. And the one thing that I want us to focus on is, wherever we're at, whether we're towards, whether we're older and we feel like we're towards the end of our ministry, or whether we're younger and we feel like, there's a lot of ministry ahead of us, it's important to stay strong and to finish strong. And we talked about it earlier, if you're feeling tired and weary, it's important to trust in the Lord and follow the Lord, because his burden is light and God will carry us through. And, so for Gideon here, we see that, internally towards the end of his life, he made some mistakes. But, to his credit, if you look at Hebrews, when Paul is writing Hebrews, if you believe Paul is the writer, Paul credits Gideon for his faith. He still led this tremendous battle, trusting in the Lord to deliver the victory. And so that's what I think should be our focus here at Calvary Chapel when we're going out and doing things in ministry in our daily lives, talking with friends and all that stuff. We should be diligent to trust in the Lord and have faith and follow the Lord, because he's going to carry us through it. If we try to do it by our own mind, we start trying to make our own decisions, that's where we're going to go astray and start making mistakes. And so we always need to collect ourselves and think, God, what do you want to do? I'm not going to get involved and try to take things over, Lord. I'm just going to listen and wait to see what you want to do. And I'll follow you faithfully into that battle. So let's go ahead and close in prayer. Lord, we thank you for the scripture, Lord, to just remind us, Lord, of how you, Lord, you help us through and you carry us through the battles even when they are insurmountable odds. Lord, that we can just trust in you, Lord, and that you may test our faith, Lord, to show us that it's really you who's at work, Lord. In the moment, Lord, we might be looking at those situations, we might be saying, Lord, why am I in this situation, Lord? This is, so impossible to accomplish and achieve. But at the same time, Lord, you might be doing that so that we would realize that when it's done and when you do deliver that battle and that victory, for us, Lord. We'll look to you and we'll be so thankful and we'll say, Lord, now I understand. You were making it seem so insurmountable so that I would trust and rely on you, Lord, and that you would get all the glory, and that we wouldn't be mistaken and think that it was our own strength or might that accomplished it, Lord. So I pray that that would be a reminder for us this week and going forward, Lord, that we would just be diligent to seek you out, Lord, and to do your will, Lord, and trust in you and faithfully follow you through that. It's in your name we pray. Amen.
Jesus ready stands